Meeting number 4. This time we're actually going to set foot in our textbook. You wondered if we were ever going to get to that. After which we're going to have to do things more by the book, literally. We're going to be following the book more closely in the remaining sessions, or else we'll just never get to a lot of important material. So I want to make sure these controls are working right. Before we do the main part of tonight's presentation, I want to lay out a couple of guiding principles for how I'm going to be approaching the rest of the subject matter and approaching the whole endeavor of giving this course here. By the way, if you missed last time, it's on video on the church's YouTube channel, and so are the earlier ones. But the first guiding principle is, I don't want to use this course for hashing out controversies. Remember, I said it was not going to be a creation versus evolution course. We may eventually mention that issue, but we actually have so many other issues to get to. I want to teach you a lot of uncontroversial things because there's a big difference between what well-informed historians of science know, whether they're Christians or not, and the things you've probably been told in school. You've probably been given a very oversimplified and somewhat biased history of science, which I'm setting out to straighten out. This is not a course on my opinions. On some issues, if you ask me what my opinion about something is, I'm going to say, I don't know. I don't have an informed opinion on that subject. And if more people could learn how to not have opinions, I think we'd live in a more rational world. The second guiding principle is science is hard, and we don't have a right to be angry at God for making the real universe complicated. We should thank him for giving us the ability to understand it to some extent. But at no point do I or does God owe you a simple world to live in. The world isn't designed for stupid people, so to speak. It's something I sometimes flippantly say, but the serious point here is there is a lot to know about, and we don't know all of it. But that doesn't mean it's not real or not worth knowing, and we have never been told to just turn our brains off and take it easy and be ignorant. That's not an option. We're highly educated people. Now let me remind you that I don't know can sometimes be the best of expert opinions. It's something you should be willing to say. Much better that than a misinformed opinion about something you don't understand. Goodness knows I say I don't know all the time. When I was in graduate school at Yale, we invented what we called the Yale Intelligence Test. The idea there was whenever somebody from outside visited our group of people in the graduate school, the challenge was how quickly you could get them to say, I don't know. The more quickly you could do that, the smarter they were. My high school educated mother passed with flying colors. I've seen Ph.D.s that flunked. Okay, so we're not angry at God for making things complicated and rich and full of wonder. Now, I'm going to tie up loose ends from the last time because there were some rather important loose ends needing to be tied up. And one important thing to know here is I'm not going to be tying up loose ends from last time every time. From here on, we have a textbook to march through. So this is the last loose ends session, I hope. But a big question that someone brought up last time is, what is science? How do you know whether something is science or is not? Well, science is a set of subjects and methods. I think everybody would agree about that. I'm going to contend, and this is not just my idiosyncratic opinion, that science is loosely defined. It doesn't have or need sharp boundaries. And the reason is scientific knowledge is not a different kind of knowledge. than simple knowledge of the real world or ordinary knowledge or something. It's not like there's scientific knowledge and there's ordinary knowledge and both are true, and what if they don't say the same thing? That is not how reality works. Science is just the study of reality. It aims at truth the same way other intellectual activities do. Here's an example. When we read that Jesus walked on water, we bring to that passage our background knowledge that the Sea of Galilee doesn't freeze over, right? Well, is that scientific knowledge, or is it everyday knowledge, or is it biblical knowledge that the Sea of Galilee doesn't freeze over?
Scientific knowledge.
I don't think there's a distinction. I don't think there's a distinction. The Bible is not a fantasy story where you have to ask whether in its imaginary world the Sea of Galilee freezes over. We're talking about the real Sea of Galilee there. So trying to distinguish everyday knowledge about the real world from scientific knowledge is not really a distinction you can press to the limit. Sometimes people will talk about a new scientific result that's different from a common belief, but that doesn't mean there are two kinds of knowledge and they're allowed to contradict each other. This has already been hashed out. In the High Middle Ages, there was a theory, and nobody was actually caught promoting this theory, but people were saying that other people had promoted it, called the double truth theory, which claimed that the same fact could be true in science and false in religion or the arts or something else. That is, double truth. The Archbishop of Paris condemned this in 1277. Now, if you study medieval philosophy and science, you'll hear a lot about the Archbishop of Paris in 1277 condemning a lot of propositions. It sounds like, oh no, they're cracking down, they're persecuting scientists. No, he's denouncing a lot of silliness. Everything that he condemned clearly deserved it. And one of them was the idea that the same thing can be true and false at the same time in science versus something else. In fact, here's the motto that I want to have on my tombstone, and I wish Melody were here. She has been informed of this. Do you prefer medieval or classical pronunciation of Latin before I read this out? Medieval Latin, veritati non contrariatur veritas. To truth is not opposed truth. In other words, truth does not conflict with truth. Aquinas in the opening passage of the Summa Contra Gentiles. This is a motto I live by. Okay, the other loose end to tie up from last time is, can science change morality? Back around mid-century, those of us who were alive then were hearing this a fair bit, that based on modern science, morality needs to change. We need a new morality. You've heard that phrase? There keep being new waves of that, and I am not going to debate any particular one of them here. But can science change morality? Well, one thing science can certainly do is discover facts about the natural world that are relevant to our moral judgments. For instance, science might discover that something harms people when that was not previously known. You would then know that it is wrong to do that thing to people. A fairly recent one is exposing them to secondhand smoke, shown by the Olmsted County study to raise the rate of heart attacks by quite a lot. In that sense, we can find out that something's wrong that we didn't previously know, but it's not the morality that changed. It's the facts about the real world. Whenever you make a moral judgment, it's about some situation or action in the real world, and scientific discovery can increase what you know about that situation or action and its effects, but it's not the morality changing. Science can't change our moral principles. The Ten Commandments are not facts about how the physical world is. They are facts about how people ought to behave. And you can't change an ought by means of a scientific discovery. You can change an is. For example, if science tells us that murder is common, that doesn't affect whether murder is wrong. And yet this is a kind of sloppy reasoning that I have seen. Now, why might people think that science can change morality? I always want to know what's going on in the minds of people I disagree with. They may know something, or they may at least lead me to test my own thoughts better. Sometimes somebody, well, this is just what I said, sometimes someone claims that science requires a change in morality if they haven't found a fact about the physical world that defines the situation we're passing judgment on, then what is going on? One possibility is that someone with a positivistic worldview, remember positivism, the belief that only the physical world is real, someone with a positivistic worldview simply can't make a distinction between morality and physical facts. Physical facts are all they can talk about. To such a person, so-and-so is wrong may mean so-and-so produces physical harm, and they can't think of anything being wrong any other way. That's a rather thin way to look at the world, but I think it's an honest mistake. A sincere positivist might think that way. The other possibility is a less honorable one. Somebody wanting to change a moral principle is trying to borrow prestige from science. And for some irrelevant reason, they want to change a moral principle, and they say that it's scientific, but they don't deliver the science and the logic that would connect it. We see this done a fair bit. It can often be a three-way mix of science, morality, and politics that's controversial. So when someone tells you science requires new moral principles, you can tell them, I can think of two different kinds of muddle you might be in. Now tell us which one. That, by the way, was a typically Thomistic answer, and I will explain Thomism a while later on. Sorry, wrong order there. Now, we finally enter our textbook, or I reveal that I've covered parts of chapter 1 and 2 already without labeling it as such and out of order. The first two chapters of the book are general ideas about how to study history of science. And I talked already about positivism versus idealism and things like that. What I want to focus on right now, for history of science as a subject, there is one big, big, big question, one big surprise. And that is, why did science as we know it, modern experimental science, only arise once in the history of the world and only in one place? It starts in the High Middle Ages, sort of fumbling around with people like Robert Grosseteste and Roger Bacon. It marches triumphantly through the early experimentalists and people like Copernicus and Kepler and Newton and the founders of chemistry and physics. It matures in the 1800s, and by 1850 or so, science is so well defined and so prestigious that the whole world is wanting to do it, and they're adopting it from Western Europe and America. So why did it work out this way? Why is it that when we look at classical civilization in India or China or Japan, although we find a lot of things, we find government, civilization, religion, poetry, logic, mathematics, linguistics. The ancient Indians had linguistics. They didn't have experimental science. Why not? It wasn't there. And that is a very strange thing. And some people are going to call me bigoted just for being thankful that I live in the part of the world where this unique thing did happen. I'm not claiming my people are better than any other people. I'm claiming that something important happened, and I'm in on it. Well, the key to the answer to this big question, which has also been pointed out by non-Christian historians, in fact, Alfred North Whitehead, who was not a Christian as far as I know, made much of this, is the Christian worldview set the stage for science. You are ready for science if you believe in a God who created the world voluntarily and made us able to understand it at least partly. And we went through some of the implications of this in the very first session. So one key aspect of the Christian worldview is that creation is not God or gods. God made it separate from himself. Creation is not the deity. God is not simply the soul of the created world. There are also not souls or spirits in inanimate objects. God is separate from creation. A second key aspect of the Christian worldview is that God chose what to create and how to create it. He chose what to do. This is called voluntarism. Nature does not flow inevitably from God's perfect essence. You have to go and look and see what actually was created, because he could perfectly well have done it differently. This is where we differ from quite a number of mystical religions. The idea is, and we also have to sort of make a break from the ancient Greeks on some of this, because we don't think that just by thinking about God's perfect nature and mathematical perfection, you can deduce how the world works. You have to actually go look at what has in fact been created. It might not be it's not the only thing God could have done. It's what he chose to do. God made what he wanted to, so another aspect of this is, unlike the Platonists, we don't believe, Platonists are, by the way, followers of the philosopher Plato. He's going to come up. We do not believe that the physical world is an imperfect reflection of some kind of mathematical ideal. We believe the physical world really is exactly what God intended to make, and so its details matter. It's not enough to say that something in the world is approximately a circle. Well, that's an imperfect reflection of a perfect circle in the mind of God. No, the thing that we find in the world is exactly what God meant it to be. And if it's not exactly a circle, then it is exactly something else, and we should care what. Now, the place of human beings in the natural world is also part of setting the stage for science. We believe that God gave us the ability and the responsibility to take charge of the natural world, not to ruin it and despoil it for our benefit, of course, but to keep it and take care of it. We hear this in Genesis 2:15, and it echoes down the centuries. Genesis 2:15 says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it." Recurrent theme is that the scientist's calling is to explore and understand nature to make people better off in many ways. By applied science, like medical cures, agricultural techniques, technology, but also we're better off when we know things. We appreciate more of the glory of God when we know things. So that's another benefit. Now, I know this session is coming out a little shorter than the previous two. We have copious question and answer time afterward that I feel a demand for, but I do want to now take you through something that's part of the backstory of many important episodes in the history of Renaissance science, especially the Galileo affair and some other conflicts between scientists and academia and the church. One of the growing pains of Renaissance science could be summed up as too much Aristotle. So I need to tell you a bit about Aristotle. But first I need to set the stage for this by pointing out that the same historical figure can be a good guy and a bad guy on the stage of history. He's a good guy when he first appears with his great ideas and insights. He's a bad guy later when people are sticking to the old philosopher rather than taking into account new things they know. So there are two examples of this kind of good guy, bad guy figure that I will mention. One is Aristotle, the other is St. Thomas Aquinas. Aristotle was most active around 330 BC. He's the Greek philosopher who wrote a lot of things down, and his writings then made it through the Middle Ages into modern times and were widely read all along. Aristotle defined several sciences and many other academic subjects and compiled what was known for posterity. So he also gave you the best of the slightly earlier Greek thinkers, generally without crediting them, I think. What was Aristotle good at? What makes him a great philosopher, one of the great minds of history? Well, he was very good at systematizing what was already known. That is, let's take what we already know about something and think it through and organize it. He had lots of good general concepts and tactics for organizing knowledge. I would say every encyclopedia and indeed every big textbook, every textbook that's more than just the author's stream of consciousness, stream of attention, owes something to Aristotle, his tactics for organizing knowledge. Aristotle was extremely good at logic. Logic, hardly altered from what Aristotle had to say, is still taught in school, in classes in informal reasoning. The next big thing to come along in logic was not until the mid-1800s when George Boole figured out it worked like algebra and you could write formulas for logic. Aristotle had not gotten to that, but he did logic extremely well and equipped a couple of millennia with tools of thought. He was also very good at ethics. His book, The Nicomachean Ethics, is still well worth reading, as is his book, The Poetics, which you will find resembles high school English class more than you could have imagined. He'll tell you things like the plot of a tragedy depends on a tragic flaw in the character of the hero, things like that. Well, what are some ideas from Aristotle, or things he at least emphasized? He didn't invent these, but he emphasized them, and they are still very important tools of thought. Well, he was good at distinguishing cause from effect from purpose. What causes something, what actually happens, and then what someone intended to happen. These can be different, and you've probably heard enough muddled political discourse where all three get mixed badly whenever there's a controversy. He made much of the distinction between matter and form, that is, what something is made out of versus what shape or arrangement it's in. This is becoming very important in the modern world because, for instance, software is form, not matter. It's still the same software when it's copied into a different material medium. Aristotle made the distinction between actual and potential, very important tool of thought. I recommend this distinction to anyone reading news headlines today. If it says can, could, may, or might, it's not reporting something that has actually happened, right? So people keep quizzing me, what do you think about this headline that so-and-so could happen? Well, it could happen. That doesn't mean it did. He named the four states of matter. He called them elements, but they're states of matter: earth, water, air, and fire, known to moderns as solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. I mean the ionized gas kind of plasma, not the blood kind of plasma. Same word means two things. He named the 5 special senses: sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. Did you learn that list in elementary school? Did you know you were learning it from Aristotle? Probably neither did the people who wrote your school book. And one of his most enduring concepts from ethics is that the right thing is often in between 2 opposite errors. For example, being brave is a good thing. It means facing danger proportionately to the benefit that will come from facing it. Being foolhardy is bad. It means facing too much danger without a good reason. And being cowardly is bad on the other side. It means not facing danger even when you really need to. So the idea of the right thing often being something you could get out of in either of 2 directions is an important Aristotelian concept. This doesn't mean the right answer to everything is always halfway between extremes. What it does mean is there are usually 2 or more ways of going wrong relative to something that's right. You don't avoid just one way of going wrong. There's at least one more. There could be more than that. Thank you, Mr. Aristotle. What was he not so good at? Well, notoriously, he was not good at anything resembling physics. He tended to make it biological, as if inanimate objects had desires. A flame wants to go up. A heavy rock wants to go down. He was not focused on searching for new knowledge. The way he saw it, there was plenty of knowledge out there already that needed to be collected and written down. So he was not particularly good at searching for new knowledge, and unfortunately, clinging to Aristotle too long discouraged experimentation. He was not good at experimentation and questioning. Medieval European thinking was strongly based on Aristotle and tended to view him as the authority. They would call him philosophos, that means the philosopher. They didn't even name him necessarily. They would just say the philosopher because everybody knew. Second person who was a good guy and then a bad guy, St. Thomas Aquinas. His major activity was around the mid-1200s. I don't remember exactly. He was a colorful character about whose biography I know almost nothing. He was the greatest Aristotelian philosopher of the Middle Ages. He was active mostly at the University of Paris. He worked out a complete system of philosophy that was based closely on Aristotle and included all of Christian doctrine. That's an accomplishment. He showed that you could take ancient Greek philosophy from Aristotle and use it to help you understand Christian doctrine. And that was quite an achievement. It caused the medieval church to finally get over its fear of the ancient Greeks and Romans. It was a big development. Now, his system of philosophy is called Thomism. That's from Thomasism, Thomism. Some good things about it, some things about it that I really like. Number one, it's based on common sense. You don't have to claim, if you're a Thomist, that any commonly recognized fact is not true. Compare this to being a positivist, where you have to believe that minds are not real, or at least not what they seem to be, that souls are not real, that only the physical universe is there. Thomas Aquinas would have none of that. He says, obviously there are physical things and non-physical things. Now we need to figure out what there is of each kind. Thomism has a place for everything. It's lots of tools of thought. You can imagine of it as like a giant cabinet where there's a place to put anything. You have a 9-foot-long broom, okay, here's the 9-foot-long broom closet. That's almost what Thomism is like, a giant cabinet. It's a good basis for comparing other systems of philosophy. Now, to give you another example of what Thomism is like, suppose you ask someone, do you believe that there are ghosts? Well, a positivist would say, no, there can't possibly be ghosts. They're not material. There can't be any such thing. A Thomist would say, well, I don't know whether there are ghosts, but if there are ghosts, I can think of 3 or 4 things they might be. Now let's inquire whether any of these actually happened. Okay, it's an open-minded way of thinking, at least initially. It became the official philosophical system of the Catholic Church. That was actually, I think, a late development. Pope Leo, 1870s or something. Don't quote me on that, but you can go look it up. I once heard Yaroslav Pelikan give a lecture about that. The question, who was Yaroslav Pelikan, is also worth looking up. Definitely another great Christian thinker. But anyway, what's not to like about the strong influence of Thomas Aquinas on Christian philosophy? Well, his system encourages complexity. Almost never do you want anything trimmed down if you're Thomas Aquinas. You want to consider every possibility you could conceivably think of, including some you wouldn't have thought of if you didn't actually sit down and work through all the combinations. Thomism contributed to the growth of complexity in Catholic doctrine that the Reformation objected to. In other words, from a Reformed Protestant point of view, they're heading in the wrong direction there. This was a framework for some of that excessive complexification that the Reformers had to object to. And of course, it encourages very strong, even excessive loyalty to Aristotle. Even in the Middle Ages, there were advocates of other systems of philosophy. For example, William of Ockham. You've heard of Occam's razor, which says things are not to be made more numerous than necessary. In other words, back off on that complexity, Thomas Aquinas. Occam made a really clear distinction between the complexity of nature and the complexity of human thoughts or beliefs. So Aquinas, in a way, was part of the problem of too much Aristotle, and the problem that kept coming back for people like Copernicus and Galileo is a lot of top academics in the 1400s and 1500s believed that if you knocked down any part of Aristotelianism, you would lose Christian doctrine. That is, that you could not be a good Christian without accepting most, if not all, of Aristotelianism. So any blow to Aristotelianism was seen as a threat to Christian orthodoxy. And Aristotle's physics was not good. It was too close to the ancient Greek concept of mathematical ideals in the mind of the creator. In the condemnation of 1277, the Archbishop already had to reject some hyper-Aristotelian ideas. People were saying God cannot create a vacuum, cannot create space with nothing in it. Well, God doesn't have to follow Aristotle. It is not true that God can't make non-circular orbits. Maybe Aristotle can only make circular orbits for the planets, but God is not limited to that. So this was the too much Aristotle problem, and it remained a growing pain for science, and it's the backstory of Galileo and Copernicus. So physical science needed to cut loose from Aristotle's rather poor physics, and attempts to do that were mistaken for rejection of Christian doctrine, as if they were trying to unseat God himself. Next time, we will dive into the book and actually be following the book to some extent. Chapters 3 and 4, we're going to hear about the rise of experimental science. I will tell you, in a preliminary way, I will tell you about Neoplatonism, which is a source of ideas other than Aristotle's that kept coming in. I'm going to tell you about early experimenters, Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton. And then I'm going to tell you what one of the growing pains was in those days, somewhat later than the days we were just talking about, and that is the difficulty of separating science from superstition. On the one hand, you don't want to dabble in the occult, but on the other hand, folk healing and so forth and alchemy may contain real physical things you need to know about, and early scientists had a big problem both keeping that straight in their own minds and getting other people not to persecute them for dabbling in the occult when they weren't dabbling in the occult. We'll get to that. Copernicus and Newton are two of my most favorite characters on the stage of history of science, and I will have to resist the temptation to give you too much technical detail about Copernicus, because so much of what the books say about Copernicus gets the technical details wrong. There was a burst of research on Copernicus in the 1970s honoring the 500th anniversary of his birth, and they found out they'd been oversimplifying and distorting the things they were telling you about him. So that is what's coming next.